Imagine just walking past a hospital or maybe a modern charitable shelter today.
Yeah.
When you look at that building, you likely picture a foundation built entirely on empathy. Like, you imagine a community pooling its resources simply because it is the right thing to do.
Yeah, it feels clean, very altruistic.
Exactly. You assume the primary motivation is just to alleviate suffering in the present moment.
And we inherently view charity through a modern secular lens. We just operate on this assumption that a social safety net is driven by a sense of civic duty, or maybe a moral obligation to help the vulnerable. The motivation seems super straightforward.
Well, what if that completely misunderstands how the safety net actually operated in the past?
Oh, it definitely does.
Right, because when we look back at the massive social safety net of medieval hospitals and almshouses, the hidden engine powering that whole system wasn't just pity. It was actually um, a highly calculated, legally binding transaction for the afterlife.
Which completely upends the traditional narrative. I mean, it takes this romanticized image of pure, selfless, medieval charity and reveals something infinitely more complex.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are taking a stack of historical sources texts detailing the theology, the daily routines, the changing demographics, and the raw economics of medieval almshouses.
It is a lot to get through.
It is. And our mission is to strip away all of those modern assumptions you might have. We are going to uncover exactly how these institutions functioned, who really held the power within them, and, the gritty day-to-day reality of the people actually sleeping in those beds.
Because it wasn't easy.
No, not at all.
Mm.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand what an almshouse was, you have to completely reset your brain and rethink the basic currency of society.
You absolutely do. To understand these institutions, we must first understand the medieval mindset regarding life, death, and specifically the soul.
Right.
You cannot look at a medieval hospital and just see bricks, mortar, and beds. You really have to see a machine designed to manipulate the spiritual world.
And that requires us to talk about the theological concept of purgatory. Looking at the sources, this was the absolute foundation of everything we are going to discuss today.
Yeah, in the medieval Catholic Church, theology dictated that after death, a soul did not typically go straight to heaven. They spent a designated amount of time in purgatory.
Which was sort of like an in-between state.
Exactly. You can think of purgatory as a state of purification or essentially a spiritual debtor's prison. The accumulated sins of a lifetime had to be expiated. They had to be actively worked off before a soul could achieve salvation.
And here's the crucial mechanism that actually built the almshouses.
Yeah.
The living could intervene on behalf of the dead.
Yes, that is the key.
The reigning belief was that prayers said by living people could directly shorten a deceased person's duration in purgatory. The math was simple. The more prayers being said for you, the faster you get out.
Which brings us to the core motivation of the wealthy elites who funded these institutions.
Right, because they had the money to set this up.
Exactly. Founding an almshouse was not simply a philanthropic gesture for the local town. It was one of the most reliable, legally structured ways to generate a permanent, ongoing supply of prayers for their own soul.
I was looking at this through the lens of a modern analogy, and it basically functions like a spiritual subscription service.
Yeah.
Or maybe a medieval GoFundMe.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
But instead of generating financial dividends or cash, it generates spiritual currency. Wealthy founders were essentially buying a permanent workforce to pray them out of purgatory. And the sources mention that the residents of these almshouses were called beadsmen or beadwomen.
Yes, and that term is very literal. The word bead translates directly to prayer.
Wow, so they were literally prayer men.
Literally.
Yeah.
As a non-negotiable condition of their residence, these men and women were required to pray for the soul of the founder every single day, often several times a day, for the rest of their natural lives.
That is intense.
It was not a suggestion. It was a strict contractual obligation written into the founding charters of the buildings.
The sheer scale of this operation is staggering when you look at specific examples. Take the Hospital of St. Cross in Winchester. That was founded in the 1130s by Bishop Henry de Blois.
A very powerful figure.
Very. And the foundation documents state he built this massive complex to provide permanent housing for 13 poor men. The texts specifically note these were impotent men, meaning they were, so physically weak or elderly that they could rarely stand without assistance.
Right.
But on top of housing those 13 men, the hospital funded a daily meal for 100 other poor men who simply showed up at the gates.
Feeding 100 men daily in the 12th century represents an institution of massive logistical scale.
I can imagine.
It requires kitchens, staff, supply chains, and vast agricultural resources just to keep the operation running.
And Bishop Henry built that massive infrastructure largely because he wanted those 13 bedridden men praying for his soul every single day until the end of time. To a modern listener, that feels incredibly transactional. It feels, I don't know, a bit grim to realize they're trading a warm bed for spiritual currency.
What's fascinating here is that we shouldn't view that transaction with pure cynicism.
Really?
Yeah, because the medieval mind did not compartmentalize the practical and the spiritual the way we do today. The founders who built these institutions genuinely believed in what they called the corporal works of mercy.
Meaning they didn't see themselves as cold-hearted businessmen making a calculated trade with human lives.
Far from it. They believed that caring for the poor was an act of genuine love in the deepest theological sense. You see concepts like agape and caritas in the texts.
Right, that profound theological love.
Exactly. It was an obligatory love that extended to the stranger, the sick, and the helpless. In their worldview, the practical act of giving an old man a warm fire and the spiritual act of saving one's own soul were not contradictory. They're two halves of the exact same action.
Okay, but if I am a wealthy medieval founder, and I am treating this like a spiritual transaction where prayers are the literal rent, I need mechanisms to ensure I'm actually getting what I paid for.
You do?
I mean, I am not going to build a massive stone complex, hand over the keys, and just hope they remember to pray for me.
Right. And the historical archives in England are full of the solution to that problem: foundation documents.
Ah, the paperwork.
Always the paperwork. These were extremely detailed, legally binding charters that spelled out the precise conditions of living in an almshouse.
I was reading through the rules in these sources, and the quotas are intense. Like, rule number 1 was mandatory prayer. You're expected to be in the chapel for specific services throughout the day.
Multiple times a day.
Right. And the founders didn't just ask for general good thoughts. They set exact numerical quotas. The documents list requirements like 50 Ave Marias, 7 Paternosters, or even reciting the entire Psalter once a week.
Yes.
For a modern listener who might not be familiar with medieval Catholic liturgy, what does that actually entail?
It represents a massive time commitment. An Ave Maria is the Hail Mary prayer, and the Paternoster is the Lord's Prayer, which was the foundational prayer of the era. Reciting 50 of one and 7 of the other takes significant time.
Yeah, it's not just a quick thought before bed.
No, but reciting the entire Psalter, which is all 150 psalms from the Bible, is essentially a full-time job.
Wow.
These residents were functioning as a dedicated spiritual workforce.
Which brings us to rule number 2, behavior. The archives show a steady stream of expulsions. People were kicked out for public drunkenness, fighting, or causing a scene in town.
You couldn't just do whatever you wanted.
My favorite detail from the sources is a resident who was formally expelled for using a vocabulary colorful enough to scandalize the other beadsmen.
Oh, I love that detail. You were required to maintain the decorum of a quasi-religious community, which brings up rule number 3, celibacy.
Right, even for married people.
Yes. Even if a specific establishment allowed married couples to move in together, they were required to maintain strict purity. They essentially had to nullify the physical aspect of their marriage and live as brother and sister.
So what does this all mean for the residents? Like, were they living in a state of constant surveillance? It sounds less like charity and more like a strict boarding school for the elderly.
It can definitely seem that way.
You have a grueling prayer schedule, you can't swear, you can't drink too much, and your marriage is fundamentally altered.
We have to evaluate those restrictions against the reality of the alternative, though. Imagine a world with absolutely no state pensions, no retirement funds, and no modern nursing home.
Yeah, it was a harsh reality.
Very. When your physical body breaks down and you can no longer work a field or a loom, your options vanish. The almshouse, for all of its rigid surveillance and strict rules, provided something invaluable.
Survival.
Survival, yes, but also dignity, a predictable routine, and most importantly, the reassurance that you are not going to freeze to death alone in an alley.
To truly judge whether that strict trade-off was worth it, I think we need to put ourselves in their shoes. We need to step inside one of these almshouses and really experience the sensory, minute-by-minute reality of a residence day.
I agree. Let's examine a typical, modest 14th century English almshouse in the dead of winter, perhaps one founded by a prosperous wool merchant who died a decade prior.
Okay, so it is 2 a.m. The nights in a medieval winter are incredibly long and brutally cold. At 2 in the morning, the chapel bell rings for matins.
The first prayer service of the day.
Right. Just imagine the physical toll of that demand. These are elderly men. They have to rise stiffly from their beds, pull their wool gowns around them, and walk across an open, freezing courtyard to the chapel.
And the sources describe the cold as sharp enough to crack stone, with their breath literally steaming in the air.
But some of them couldn't even make that walk, right?
Exactly. For some of the older men whose joints simply won't permit that walk in the ice, they remain in their beds.
Do they just sleep through it?
No, they don't go back to sleep. They lie there in the absolute dark, their lips moving soundlessly, whispering the prescribed prayers to fulfill their contract.
Meanwhile, inside the chapel, you have a young chaplain, a priest hired specifically by the foundation leading the office. The chapel is barely lit by a handful of cheap tallow candles. The stone walls are radiating cold.
It's a very bleak scene.
Very. And the beadsmen are joining in with these old, fragile, not always tuneful voices.
Yeah.
I just keep wondering how physically vulnerable people survived a 2 a.m. wake-up call in a freezing stone chapel.
The physical hardship was immense, there's no doubt. But the canonical hours, the schedule of prayers like Matins, Prime, Vespers, and Compline functioned as the unyielding clock that governed all medieval life.
It was just how time worked.
It wasn't just a schedule, it was the rhythm of reality. After Matins, they returned to bed. Dawn brings lauds, and then Prime. By this time, the kitchen fire is finally lit.
And one major benefit highlighted in the sources is that they did not have to cook for themselves.
Huge benefit.
Right. Many almshouses employed a dedicated cook. Breakfast usually consisted of day-old bread and ale drawn from a barrel. They sit at long trestle tables in a small communal hall.
And while some places required monastic silence during meals, many allowed conversation.
Yeah, the sources say they talked about the weather, whose arthritis was flaring up, or the founder's upcoming anniversary day, which meant a rare, special feast.
The morning then passes with necessary chores. If the ground isn't frozen solid, some work in the garden. Others mend clothing by the fire. The chaplain often functioned as a caretaker, actually, walking among them with a small jar of herbal oil to rub on their swollen joints.
At noon, the bell rings for sext, the midday prayer, followed by the main meal. On a standard winter Wednesday, the menu is pretty sparse. You were getting a thick pottage of dried peas and onions alongside some salted fish.
Meat was an absolute luxury, strictly saved for Sundays and major church feast days.
And the afternoon.
The afternoon provides their longest stretch of unstructured time. Some residents sleep, some sit as close to the hall fire as possible.
Trying to stay warm.
Exactly. You might have a former tailor who has permission to take in small mending jobs from the town, squinting in the thin, gray winter light. Another resident, who possesses the rare skill of literacy, might slowly work through a small, battered book of songs.
Then dusk hits. Vespers is sung as the sun goes down, and finally, Compline, the last prayer of the day. A specific detail in the text regarding Compline really stood out to me.
Which one?
At that final service, they would sing the Nunc Dimittis, which is the Canticle of Simeon.
Ah, yes. Translating that canticle, the core line is, "Lord, now you let your servant go in peace, according to your word."
It is essentially a prayer for a peaceful death. When you visualize an entire institution filled with elderly people all approaching the end of their lives, singing that specific prayer together every single night,
It carried a profound psychological weight.
it really does. It highlights the psychological comfort embedded deeply within this strict routine. After that prayer concludes, the candles are extinguished. The chaplain locks the heavy chapel door.
And they're locked in for the night. Yes. The gatekeeper secures the outer gates of the complex. The residents retreat to their small rooms, where a low fire is burning in the grate, and they sleep.
It's quite a balance.
It is. The brutal physical hardship of the cold and the 2 a.m. wake-ups was balanced by an immense emotional and spiritual security. They were safe behind those locked gates.
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. That daily routine, that exact rhythm, was not exclusively experienced by old men.
Not at all.
The sources reveal a crucial pivot in history. A massive catastrophic event completely changed the demographics of who actually needed these houses, bringing women to the absolute forefront of the system.
This demographic shift was driven by the Black Death.
The big plague pandemic.
Exactly, the one that struck between 1347 and 1351. The plague fundamentally altered the social and economic fabric of medieval society.
The mortality rates were devastating. And the plague killed disproportionate numbers of men. That demographic anomaly left behind a massive population of widows.
Women who suddenly had no male relatives to support them.
Right. Women who frequently lost their expected inheritances due to complex property laws and who found themselves aging, alone, and completely locked out of the traditional guild systems.
So the almshouse system was forced to expand rapidly to meet this specific demographic crisis. It evolved from a general charitable endeavor into a targeted response to a social reality.
The sources mention a few specific places. In Paris, for instance, there were 10 shelters built specifically and exclusively for poor widows, known as the Maison des Pauvres Femmes.
Yes, and in Florence, the Orbitello Hospital was established in 1370. It housed over 200 guests, and the vast majority of them were elderly women.
Were their daily lives similar to the men's?
Largely identical. The same grueling prayer schedules, the same communal food, the same strict rules. The women's houses, however, were slightly more likely to temporarily take in destitute young girls to help place them in domestic service.
That makes sense. But the most notable shift during this period is the administrative power women began to wield. We see women stepping into roles as founders and wardens.
Yes, they are drafting complex legal statutes and aggressively negotiating endowments with local bishops.
We so often picture medieval women as having very little agency, constrained entirely by the men around them. But the sources highlight a wealthy 14th century Parisian widow who completely breaks that stereotype.
Oh, she is a fascinating historical figure.
She really is. She essentially acted as a theological CEO. She founded a house specifically for 40 widows, all aged 50 or older.
And her administrative oversight was remarkably precise.
She dictated the exact daily food allowances down to the ounce. She set specific, non-negotiable prayer schedules, dictating the exact order the prayers had to be recited.
Yeah, like nothing to chance.
Nothing. And most notably, she instituted a ruthless two-strike rule. If a resident missed the prescribed prayers, they received one formal warning. If they missed them a second time, they were permanently expelled. She ran a ridiculously tight ship.
Her actions demonstrate a massive assertion of agency. This wasn't just abstract charity. She was actively managing the primary safety net for women displaced by a pandemic. Women who possessed the financial means took total control of that infrastructure and managed it with incredible legal precision.
But whether an institution was run by a strict Parisian widow or a powerful English bishop, feeding, housing, and providing firewood for hundreds of people requires a massive functioning economy.
It takes a lot of capital.
You need steady, reliable cash flow. So how was this entire system funded over centuries? And what caused its sudden catastrophic collapse?
Well, the economic engine of the entire system relied on endowments. A founder did not just hand over a pile of coins because coins run out.
Right, inflation and spending.
Exactly.
Right.
They created a legal trust. They gave income-producing assets like a working farm, a mill, or urban real estate to a board of trustees.
Ah, so it generated its own income.
Yes. The rent generated by those lands paid the ongoing costs in perpetuity. The land paid for the food, the fuel, the chaplain's salary, and the daily penny allowance for the residents.
Let's focus on that penny a day, actually. Because to a modern ear, giving someone a single penny sounds like an insult. But the economic reality of the 15th century paints a very different picture.
Oh, entirely different. By the 16th century, rapid inflation completely destroyed its value. But in the 1400s, 1 penny possessed real purchasing power.
What could you buy with it?
It could buy a large loaf of bread, a dozen eggs, or a small piece of fish.
Okay, wow. That's significant.
When you combine that daily cash with a free room, free firewood, and communal meals, that single penny granted the residents a vital degree of economic independence.
And it wasn't exclusively the mega-wealthy founders carrying the load either. The sources show deep community integration. Ordinary citizens would leave small bequests in their wills, like a shilling here, a length of wool cloth there.
Local trade guilds donated money too.
Yeah, merchants would sponsor a special meal on a feast day. It was a deeply embedded network of local social obligation.
It was a fragile, decentralized system, certainly, but it provided a real, functioning safety net for the elderly poor across medieval towns.
Which brings me to the great mystery of this entire deep dive.
Okay.
If this system was so deeply embedded in the local culture, funded by local land rents, supported by local guilds, and managed by local trustees, how could it be dismantled so quickly? The collapse, when we look at the timeline, is incredibly brutal.
It was brutal. The collapse occurred in the 1530s, driven by the dissolution of the monasteries under King Henry VIII.
But wait, the monasteries were functionally separate from the local almshouses?
Right.
Why would Henry seizing monastic wealth destroy local hospitals funded by town merchants?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the legal mechanism of those endowments. The monasteries were the administrative backbone of the entire system.
Oh, I see.
In many cases, the legal title to the lands that funded the almshouses was held by the local monastery. When Henry dissolved the monasteries and the crown seized their assets, they didn't just take the monks' wealth.
They took the hospital trust funds, basically.
Exactly. They legally absorbed the endowment lands of the hospitals into the royal treasury.
So the wealth that was generating the rent to buy the bread and the firewood didn't just dry up. It was legally confiscated by the crown overnight.
Precisely. The system was inextricably tied to a specific religious and legal infrastructure. When the politics at the very top of the hierarchy shifted, the safety net at the very bottom instantly collapsed.
That is awful for the residents.
It was a disaster. The local town councils lacked the legal authority and the capital to simply take over those massive trusts. Some institutions survived, but the golden age of that specific, localized transactional model was completely shattered.
It is wild to synthesize all of this. We started this deep dive looking at a system that initially appears quite cold. A transactional theology where you sign a contract to trade a prayer for a peaceful death in a freezing stone chapel in exchange for a bowl of pottage and a bed.
It sounds harsh at first glance.
But when you examine the mechanisms closely, you see a genuine community care system. You see widows wielding immense agency, taking charge of their own survival after a global pandemic. You see a decentralized economy where a penny a day granted dignity to people who had absolutely nothing else.
It was a highly sophisticated framework that monetized empathy. It blended self-interest for the afterlife with true, tangible support for the vulnerable in the present.
And yet, despite being woven into the fabric of daily life, it was almost entirely wiped out by a single political decree simply because the administrative structure it relied upon became a target for a king's financial ambitions.
Which raises an important question for us to consider today. The medieval safety net was devastated in an instant by a top-down shift in government policy during the dissolution of the monasteries.
Right.
It forth as a thought experiment. If our modern social safety nets, the massive institutions we assume are permanent and unshakable, were suddenly dismantled overnight by a radical shift in policy.
Imagine attending your own funeral. Like you're breathing, your heart is beating, you are fully conscious.
But you're kneeling right there in a church.
Exactly. You're kneeling there while a priest scatters grave dirt on your feet and formally, literally erases your legal existence from the world.
It's a terrifying thought.
Oh, absolutely.
That's
And for generations, we've been taught that this was the horrific, isolating reality for a medieval person diagnosed with leprosy, the classic image you probably have in your head right now.
Right, that Hollywood trope.
Yeah, that movie trope. Just wretched, abandoned people wrapped in rags, banished to a cave somewhere deep in the woods, entirely cut off from civilization, and just left to waste away in squalor.
We just assume society's response was pure, unadulterated terror and neglect.
Right. But, as we'll see today, the historical record tells a radically different and honestly a far more complex story. Today, we're going deep into a really fascinating stack of source material, a combination of medieval textual records and modern archaeological data from hospital excavations.
It's some incredibly revealing stuff.
It really is. So, our mission for this deep dive is to completely dismantle that Hollywood myth and then try to solve the historical mystery of how a massive civilization-defining crisis seemingly vanished overnight.
Yeah, and to really understand this history, we have to look past those modern assumptions of the huddled, forgotten outcasts. We need to examine the actual physical, architectural, and economic structures that medieval society built around this disease.
Because it wasn't just a handful of people in the woods.
Not at all. When you dive into the archaeology and the contemporary records, what emerges isn't a story of neglect. It's a story of incredibly complex institution building.
Okay, let's unpack this because the reality we see in these sources looks much less like a horror movie of banished outcasts and a lot more like, well, a highly regulated, surprisingly well-funded medieval corporation.
That's a great way to put it.
But to understand how these massive institutions operated, we do have to start with that terrifying ritual we mentioned. Because entering the system was essentially a literal separation from the living.
It was. We actually have a remarkably well-preserved medieval manuscript from Exeter that details the exact separation ritual. And the mechanics of it are chilling.
Yeah, reading through the sources, it's intense.
A person diagnosed with leprosy would be brought into their local church, right? And a black cloth or sometimes a canopy.
Like the exact kind used to cover a coffin?
Yes, exactly
Ugh.
that kind. It was placed over them while they knelt, and the priest would then conduct a full mass for the dead over a living, breathing person.
And that's where the earth was scattered on their feet, physically mimicking a burial.
Right.
But the ritual didn't stop at the symbolism, which is wild. The priest then pronounced a specific series of prohibitions that systematically stripped away their previous life. I actually have the translation from the Exeter manuscript here.
Oh, read it. It's fascinating.
Okay, so the priest says, I forbid you to enter the church. I forbid you to enter the market, the mill, the bakehouse, or any gathering of people.
So immediately cutting off social ties.
Right, and it goes on. I forbid you to wash your hands or any part of your body in the spring or in any running stream. I forbid you to touch anything you buy until it is yours.
The physical isolation was strictly codified.
Yeah, and then this last part. I forbid you to go without your leper's clothes, to go without your bell, to be in any street without warning people of your approach.
Wow. Walking out of that church, you were legally entirely different. You were subjected to a legal concept known as being civilly dead.
Which means your legal existence was just effectively erased. Reading through the legal documents from the time, the implications are staggering.
Your property could be redistributed to your heirs,
Right.
as if you had actually passed away.
Exactly. And your marriage was legally dissolved in theory because leprosy was considered a canonical ground for separation. I mean, your previous life was over.
It was a clean break.
But, looking at these prohibitions, there's a glaring logical inconsistency here that I want to push back on.
Oh.
Well, if society truly considered these people legally dead, and if the absolute goal was to banish them, hide them, and just forget about them, requiring them to ring a bell or rattle a wooden clapper everywhere they went makes zero sense.
I see where you're going with this.
Right. Because if you want to erase someone, you don't mandate that they carry a noisemaker. You banish them silently. The bell implies they were still supposed to be moving through the periphery of society.
That is the crucial tension in the medieval response. The bell is often misinterpreted today as just a warning system for healthy people to, run away.
Like a siren.
Exactly. But functionally, it was a vital tool for their survival in this new life. They needed to be noticed.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The entire system relied on charity, and you simply cannot receive alms if no one knows you're standing there. The bell was an economic tether to the very society that had just declared them civilly dead.
Wow. And that tether brings us to a massive contradiction in the historical record. Society considered them legally dead on paper, but physically and economically. Medieval society was busy building an absolute empire for them to live in.
A literal empire. The scale is staggering.
It is. The sources highlight a statistic from a Benedictine monk and chronicler named Matthew Paris. He recorded that by the year 1225, there were approximately 19,000 leprosaria across Europe.
19,000 massive infrastructure projects. Just let that sink in.
It's mind-blowing.
And in England alone, by the 12th century, there were at least 300 of these specific leper hospitals.
Which completely destroys the idea that they were being tossed into the wilderness to fend for themselves. 19,000 facilities require serious capital, land acquisition, and continuous funding.
Absolutely. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the geography of where they built these places completely shatters the isolation myth.
Because they weren't in the woods.
No, they were deliberately constructed just outside the town walls or right along the primary roads leading into major settlements.
It's essentially the medieval equivalent of placing a highway toll booth, or like a highly visible billboard on the interstate.
Visibility was their economic lifeblood.
Exactly. They were strategically positioned for maximum foot traffic because they needed that steady, reliable stream of passing travelers to ensure charitable donations. They were placed to be seen.
And when we look at the physical architecture of these 19,000 leprosaria, they mirrored monasteries. We're talking about extensive complexes here.
Right. They weren't just like little wooden shacks.
Not at all. They featured a central chapel, individual or shared rooms for the residents who, by the way, were called brothers and sisters, large communal kitchens, extensive gardens, and surrounding agricultural land.
The sources specifically mention brew houses too, which I found fascinating. We tend to forget that in the medieval period, beer wasn't just for recreation. The brewing process made it much safer to drink than local water, and it provided a vital source of daily calories.
Oh, for sure. These hospitals had their own self-sustaining microeconomies. They were functioning, structured communities.
So they were basically farming.
Yes, The residents grew their own vegetables, they kept pigs and chickens, they tended bees, which was incredibly lucrative because beeswax was a major cash crop for church candles, and honey was the primary sweetener of the era.
But because they were built and structured like monasteries, their daily lives were subjected to a brutal level of micromanagement.
Oh, the rules were intense.
Right, because the financial reliance on public charity meant the residents had to project an image of extreme piety. The local townspeople weren't going to hand over their hard-earned money if the brothers and sisters were throwing rowdy parties.
Exactly. The financial model dictated the behavior. If we look at the regulations for the Hospital of St. Giles in Norwich, it reads stricter than the most intense modern boarding school.
I was reading that. It's wild.
Right. There was absolute silence mandated during dinner. You could not leave the hospital precinct without the master's explicit permission. Gambling was strictly prohibited.
No fun allowed.
None. No unauthorized women were allowed on the grounds. And they had mandatory attendance at the chapel for the 7 canonical hours of prayer every single day.
Even their clothing was strictly regulated. They had to wear specific habits, long garments of gray or brown cloth, so they were instantly identifiable.
Uniforms, basically.
Yeah. And when they did go to market, adhering to those Exeter prohibitions from earlier, they couldn't physically touch the goods. They had to stand downwind, point to the bread or supplies they wanted with a wooden stick, and wait for the merchant to set it down. No direct physical contact.
It was an intensely regimented existence. But the archaeological data reveals something totally counterintuitive about the result of all that strict regulation.
The bones. This completely changed how I viewed the topic.
The bones tell the real story.
Yeah, archaeologists excavated the cemetery at St. Mary Magdalene in Winchester, which is one of the best-studied leper hospitals in England. And when they examined the skeletal remains of the residents, they found that these people were remarkably well-fed.
The contrast is what makes it so significant. When osteologists compare the bones from the leper hospital to the skeletons of the healthy urban poor buried in normal city cemeteries, the lepers show relatively few signs of severe nutritional deficiencies.
I mean, think about that. The legally dead outcasts suffering from a terrifying disease were eating better and more consistently than the healthy people struggling to survive inside the city walls.
Because that massive infrastructure worked, the gardens, the pigs, the bees, and those constant charitable donations from the passing traffic on the main road, it all provided a highly consistent food supply.
And some of them were basically landlords, right?
Oh, yeah. Some of the larger institutions, like St. Nicholas at Harbledown, accumulated extensive land holdings over the centuries that generated serious rental income.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The sources give us this incredible flash of humanity that breaks through all the rigid rules and the osteological data.
Oh, the soup incident.
Yes. There is a surviving record from the year 1312 detailing a resident named Thomas. Thomas was formally expelled from his hospital because he struck a fellow brother with a ladle over an argument about soup.
It is a brilliant piece of microhistory.
It's incredible because it highlights the profound, stubborn humanity of these spaces. You do not get into a passionate ladle fight over the quality of soup if you have given up on life.
That's very true.
Despite having a horrifying flesh-eating disease, Thomas still had a temper. He had an appetite. He had very strong opinions about how the kitchen ought to be run. They were living complex, textured lives.
They experienced boredom, formed deep friendships, had petty arguments, and received family visits. We even see that empathy and connection physically built into the stone architecture of the hospitals.
Right, the windows.
Yeah, in many of the chapels, architects built small angled windows called squints or hagioscopes.
I saw those in the architectural diagrams. They were positioned so perfectly that a patient who was entirely bedridden in the adjacent infirmary ward could look right through the stone wall, have a clear line of sight to the altar, and still participate in the community's spiritual life.
They were physically integrated into the heart of the institution. They were never fully isolated.
But despite the adequate food, the architectural empathy, and the vibrant daily life, there was still a grim biological reality hanging over the brothers and sisters. The medicine of the medieval period couldn't actually cure the Mycobacterium leprae bacteria.
No, it was incurable.
Which brings up a major question about how medieval doctors actually approached a condition they knew they couldn't cure. We know they relied heavily on humoral theory, right? The concept that the human body is governed by 4 humors, blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, and that illness is caused by an imbalance of these fluids.
Yes, but the sources show they actually classified leprosy into highly specific subtypes based on this theory. The medical categorizations were incredibly detailed.
Oh, after.
They observed the different physical manifestations of the disease and mapped them onto the humors. For instance, there was elephantia, which caused the skin to thicken heavily. Medieval physicians believed this was caused by an excess of melancholic blood, which they characterized as cold and dry.
And then there was leonina, or lion leprosy, which they linked to choleric blood.
Right.
Pteria, or serpent leprosy, was associated with phlegmatic blood, and alopecia, or fox leprosy, stemming from what they called corrupted blood.
Because they believed the root cause was a specific humoral imbalance, they didn't just throw random herbs at the patients. They used targeted botanical treatments grown right there in their physic gardens to try and chemically counteract the specific humor.
So it was actually quite scientific for the time.
Very methodical. If you had elephantia caused by a cold and dry melancholic blood, a medieval physician would prescribe herbs categorized as hot and wet to try and force the body back into equilibrium.
The sources actually list some of the specific treatments they used in the gardens. There was a highly complex polypharmacy compound called theriac, which could contain dozens of ingredients and took months to prepare.
A very premium medicine back then.
Yeah. They also used clary sage, specifically for inflammation. A plant called weld was applied for skin conditions. They used plantain, which actually does have mild natural astringent and antiseptic properties, and fumitory.
Which shows they were observing real physical effects, even
Yeah.
if their underlying theory was flawed.
Exactly. Now, obviously, we know none of this cured the underlying bacterial infection,
Yeah.
but understanding the mechanism of humoral theory changes how we view these treatments. It gave the patients and the caregivers agency.
That's a crucial point.
It made the condition something to be managed rather than just passively endured. It wasn't just a curse anymore. It was a chronic medical condition.
But what's fascinating here is that the ultimate treatment, the real economic engine of this entire 19,000 hospital system, wasn't herbal or botanical at all. It was prayer. Those mandatory 7 canonical hours of prayer we mentioned earlier weren't just about keeping the residents busy or spiritually preparing them for death. That prayer was literal currency.
The theological mechanics behind this are fascinating. It ties into the medieval concept of purgatory. People believed that if you sinned, you had to spend time in purgatory after death to be cleansed before entering heaven.
Right.
But the lepers, because of their intense physical suffering, were viewed by medieval society as serving their purgatory right here on earth.
Exactly. Because they were already enduring their purification, medieval theology held that a leper's prayers had a direct, fast-tracked line to God.
Wow. So the wealthy patrons weren't just being altruistic when they funded these hospitals. They were giving massive sums of money, specifically to purchase the prayers of the lepers for their own souls.
It was a transaction.
Spiritual transaction. The lepers prayed for their patrons. They asked passing pilgrims to pray for them. The wealthy elites essentially funded these 19,000 institutions to buy spiritual real estate.
It was a thriving, deeply interconnected ecosystem dominating the medieval landscape. The healthy needed the spiritual labor of the sick, and the sick needed the financial capital of the healthy.
So what does this all mean? Because we have this massive civilization-defining infrastructure, and then it just emptied out.
It really did.
The historical records show that after the mid-14th century, leprosy began to decline precipitously across Europe.
Yeah.
By the 16th century, these grand, well-funded hospitals were largely sitting empty. A disease that shaped the architecture, law, and theology of the continent essentially vanished.
It remains one of the great historical mysteries in medical history. How does a dominant disease just pack up and leave? Historians and epidemiologists have debated this for generations, and there are 3 primary competing biological theories.
Okay, let's hear them.
The first centers squarely on the mid-14th century arrival of the Black Death.
I mean, the timing lines up perfectly. Leprosy severely compromises the immune system. When the bubonic plague swept through Europe, killing an estimated third of the population, it would have ripped through those leprosaria with devastating efficiency.
Oh, absolutely.
The plague acts as a massive, acute shock, effectively wiping out the most vulnerable hosts to the leprosy bacterium all at once.
It's a brutal but highly plausible epidemiological mechanism. However, the plague didn't hit every single isolated town in Europe simultaneously or with the exact same severity, yet leprosy still declined everywhere over time.
Right.
Which brings us to the second theory, involving the rise of tuberculosis in the 14th and 15th centuries.
And this is where the microbiology gets really interesting, because the bacterium that causes tuberculosis, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, is from the exact same family as the bacterium that causes leprosy, Mycobacterium leprae.
They are very closely related, which means the lipid structures on the surface of the bacteria are similar. The theory suggests that as tuberculosis rapidly spread through the increasingly crowded urban centers of late medieval Europe, infection with TB may have provided a degree of cross-immunity against leprosy.
It's essentially a microbial turf war.
A turf war.
Yeah. Think about it. You have a new, highly aggressive pathogen tuberculosis moving into the population. The human immune system fights off a mild TB infection, learns to recognize those lipid structures, and as a byproduct, it accidentally gains the blueprints to fight off the leprosy bacteria.
That's a great analogy.
The new gang takes over the neighborhood and effectively locks out the old gang. Just by being there, they accidentally protect the neighborhood from the old threat.
It's a very compelling biological possibility. The third theory is a bit broader. It suggests that there were slight gradual improvements in diet, housing, and general health for some populations in the later medieval period.
Just better overall immunity.
Exactly. A stronger baseline immune system across the population makes it harder for a slow-acting bacteria like Mycobacterium leprae to gain a foothold.
Well, whatever the exact combination of causes was,
Yeah.
the acute shock of the plague, the cross-immunity from TB, or stronger diets, the result on the ground was undeniable. The bells fell silent, the chapels emptied out.
They did.
But the physical buildings, those 19,000 complex institutions, didn't just disappear.
No, they adapted. As the population of leprosy patients vanished, these vast empty buildings were gradually converted into almshouses. This became the quiet afterlife of the leprosarium. They were repurposed to provide long-term housing for the elderly poor, former servants who had aged out of work, injured tradespeople, widows with no inheritance.
The sources actually highlight a specific example that really grounds this evolution, the Hospital of St. Oswald in Worcester. It was actually founded way back around the year 990, but its later history shows the enduring mission of these spaces.
Yeah, that's a great example.
It housed the elderly poor, but it also had this absolute delightful mandate to shelter travelers who arrived after the city gates had closed for the night.
Because the mechanics of a medieval city required the gates to be locked at sundown for security. If you were a traveler and you missed that curfew, you were stuck outside the walls in the dark, highly vulnerable to bandits or freezing temperatures.
Right.
But you could knock on the door of the hospital, which, remember, was purposefully built just outside the walls.
And they would take you in. It's a beautiful evolution of purpose. These spaces started out wrapped in this terrifying ritual of the civilly dead, dripping with religious fear and grave dirt. But when you actually look inside the walls, we found vibrant humanity.
We really did.
We found Thomas stubbornly swinging his soup ladle, the bustling microeconomies of bees and brew houses, the architectural empathy of the hagioscopes allowing the bedridden to see the altar, and a highly sophisticated, if misunderstood, system of humoral medicine.
It's incredible.
And finally, when the medical mystery of the disease's disappearance emptied the wards, they didn't tear them down. They evolved into these quiet, enduring safety nets for the elderly and the stranded.
This raises an important question, though. Examining this history forces a reevaluation of how we view the past. Our modern assumptions about the medieval era are so often clouded by a sense of superiority.
Oh, we always think we know better.
Right. What we assume was a dark age of squalor and neglect was actually a massive 19,000 building-strong, well-funded infrastructure of care. They built a sophisticated system based on the humoral science and the theological currency they had available to them.
It completely rewrites that Hollywood trope of the ragged outcast in the cave. We started this deep dive looking at a funeral mass for a living person, but the reality was a society trying to manage a crisis through massive institution building. But to wrap up today, I want to leave you with a thought to mull over. Building on that incredible historical vanishing act we just discussed, we just look at a civilization-defining, terrifying, incurable disease that shaped the laws and architecture of an entire continent. And then it just quietly plummeted from the face of the earth due to unseen biological variables, like a microbial turf war with a rival bacteria, or the sudden shock of a plague. It makes you wonder, what seemingly permanent crisis or incurable disease. So if you walk into like any modern hospital today, the sensory experience is just unmistakable. You know exactly where you are.
Oh, totally. It's immediate.
Right. You are instantly hit with that harsh glare of the fluorescent lights and that sharp, stinging scent of clinical bleach, and of course the relentless, random beeping of the heart monitors everywhere.
Yeah, it's a very specific vibe. It's an environment that's just meticulously engineered to um, isolate the physical body, to treat it as like a complex biological machine that just needs repairing.
Exactly. We demand that our medicine today be visible, measurable, and above all, perfectly sterile. I mean, the architecture itself kind of reflects this deep desire to seal illness away from the natural world.
It really does. But peeling back the centuries to look at medieval medicine, it reveals a completely different paradigm.
It's radically different, and that is exactly what today's deep dive is all about. We are stepping out of that sterile, brightly lit modern clinic and into a profoundly different landscape. We're going to be pulling insights from a really fascinating historical document today. It's titled Boring History for Sleep Medieval Hospital Script, page 8-14.pdf.
Catchy title, right?
Right, very catchy. But the content is incredible. The mission here is to look far past those persistent and honestly kind of tired stereotypes of the Dark Ages. You might think medieval medicine was just, random leeches and superstitions, but we're going to decode how these early institutions treated the human body and the soul with this surprising, albeit very strange, exactness.
Yeah, because if you imagine yourself walking into one of these medieval wards, the very first thing you'd notice isn't a smell or a specific sight.
What would it be?
It would be a profound shift in how time itself operates. Patient life was governed by this overarching structure they called the Great Silence.
Great silence. That sounds intense.
It was a rhythm dictated entirely by the ringing of bells. So you woke to the bells of matins, you ate when the bells signaled, you prayed to the bells of vespers, and you finally slept when the candles were put out and the heavy silence of the night began.
Wow. So instead of that chaotic, formless sprawl of days that you usually get when you're severely ill and bedridden, every single hour had a specific purpose.
Exactly. It gave a definitive, sacred shape to the day. For a patient who was coming in off the harsh, unforgiving streets of a medieval city, this structure just stripped away the terrifying unpredictability of daily survival.
Which makes me think it's almost like, okay, hear me out. It sounds like modern circadian rhythm hacking or like one of those extreme wellness retreats.
I mean, you're not wrong.
Like, was this rigid structure actually accidentally brilliant for reducing stress in severely ill people?
Oh, absolutely. Providing that strict rhythm served a vital physiological function. It essentially created a highly controlled environment where the body's natural healing mechanisms could finally just engage.
Because they weren't constantly in fight or flight mode anymore.
Precisely. We often think of medieval care as primitive, but the baseline physical comfort provided in these well-run monastic and civic institutions was actually substantial. The diet, for instance, was frequently vastly superior to what the average poor citizen had access to on the outside.
Right. The document mentions they got daily rations of fresh bread and this hearty pottage.
Yeah, a pottage. It's like a thick, slow-cooked stew of vegetables, grains, and, whatever meat was available.
And on Fridays, and during the really long season of Lent, because they had to keep with strict church dietary laws, they served fish.
Which was often harvested directly from the hospital's own meticulously cultivated fish ponds, which is a huge flex for a hospital back then.
A farm-to-table medieval hospital. That's amazing.
Yeah.
And they even got daily allowances of diluted wine, right?
They did. Which was actually a genius move because it neatly bypassed the severe gastrointestinal hazards of drinking untreated town water.
Water was basically a biohazard back then.
Pretty much. Add to that the profound impact of ambient warmth. These large, cavernous wards were continuously heated by massive central hearths or heavy iron braziers.
Which is huge, because if someone is suffering from severe exposure after freezing on the streets, simply being placed in a consistently warm room often triggered physical recoveries that appeared, well, miraculous to the hospital staff.
Right. It looked like a miracle, but it was just basic hypothermia recovery.
Yeah.
And this physical intervention extended directly to hygiene, too.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Because you don't usually associate the Middle Ages with great hygiene.
Well, in these hospitals, a patient's soiled street clothes were washed or completely replaced right upon entry, and their linen bedding was changed regularly.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The brothers and sisters operating these hospitals actually took vows to serve the sick as though they were serving the lords of the house. So they provided material comfort, they sat with the dying through the entire night, and they administered sacraments.
So they were treating the whole person, the body,
Wow.
but also simultaneously tending to the eternal destiny of the patient.
Exactly. But once a patient was warm, clothed, and fed, the actual treatment of specific ailments relied heavily on the hospital's physic garden.
Right, the physic garden.
Yeah.
And these were not just like wild patches of weeds behind the kitchen, right?
No, not at all. Physic gardens were meticulously organized, highly geometric plots of land. We actually have this famous 9th century architectural plan from the monks of St. Gall in Switzerland.
Oh, I saw that in the source text. It details exactly 18 specific medicinal beds, right?
Yes, 18 beds, each cultivated for distinct, specific therapeutic properties.
And the crazy thing is, the plants they grew in those 18 beds, stuff like willow bark, feverfew, elderflower, garlic, chamomile, lavender, they are genuinely effective.
Very effective.
I mean, we know today that willow bark contains salicylic acid, which is literally the chemical foundation of modern aspirin.
Right, they were growing natural aspirin.
But here's where I completely lose the thread of their medical logic. Because their justification for prescribing these plants wasn't based on chemistry. It was based entirely on humoral theory.
Ah, yes, the humors, inherited from ancient Greek physicians like Galen.
Right. So explain the humors to me, because it sounds wild.
So, humoral medicine categorized the entire universe, including the human body, by 4 fundamental humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile.
Okay.
And every ailment, every plant, and every type of food was assigned a specific humoral character. It was mapped on a matrix of being either hot or cold and wet or dry.
So if a physician diagnosed an illness, let's say a severe chest cold, they might say it was caused by a cold and wet imbalance in the body.
Exactly. And then the herbalist would counter it with a plant classified as hot and dry.
Okay, but biologically speaking, that entire framework of hot, cold, wet, and dry humors floating around the organs is fundamentally incorrect. It's just not how bodies work.
No, it is completely wrong at a cellular level.
So how on earth did a completely flawed theory lead them to so many correctly prescribed, highly effective botanical treatments? Like, did the flawed theory just accidentally force them to pay hyper-close attention to cause and effect?
That's a great way to look at it. Viewing humoral theory as literal cellular biology makes it seem absurd to us today. But if you look at it as an early form of the scientific method, its utility becomes super clear.
How so?
Well, it provided a strict, standardized language to catalog generations of trial and error. So a medieval physician obviously didn't know the molecular structure of salicylic acid.
Right, they didn't have microscopes.
But they had centuries of meticulously recorded data proving that willow bark reduced a fever. So the language of hot and dry just gave them a highly systematic framework to record, teach, and apply that practical observation.
Oh, I see. It was basically a filing system for medicinal cause and effect.
Exactly. Just look at the work of Hildegard of Bingen.
Oh, she was the 12th century abbess, right?
Yeah, an abbess, a mystic, a total polymath. Her major medical treatise, Kazai-i-Kurai, prescribed these highly specific combinations of herbs and minerals based on an individual's unique physical constitution. And even though she utilized the theoretical language of the humors, her actual prescriptions were shockingly accurate. Because she was just an incredibly astute empirical observer of the natural world, she noticed what worked and just used the dominant vocabulary of her era to document it.
Okay, so applying that humoral filing system to a soothing herbal tea, it's actually pretty brilliant. I get that. But applying that exact same logic to the internal mechanics of the human body, that took medieval medicine into some far more aggressive territory, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Because the theory dictated that illness was a physical imbalance of internal fluids, treatments often involved severe mechanical interventions.
Meaning they had to physically remove the bad fluids.
Right. Excess blood, which was categorized as hot and wet, supposedly needed to be manually drained to restore equilibrium.
Which leads us to the danger zone. Widespread practices like bloodletting, the application of leeches, and cupping, right? Using heated glass cups to draw blood to the surface.
Yeah. They viewed the body almost like a closed hydraulic system. If the pressure was too high, you simply opened a valve and drained the fluid. They were completely blind to the microscopic reality of bacteria or how the circulatory system actually functioned.
It's like a medieval mechanic trying to fix a complex modern car engine. They're treating the human body like a machine that just needs its oil drained.
That is a perfect analogy, and their diagnostics followed that exact same mechanical logic. Uroscopy was the absolute gold standard of medieval internal medicine.
Uroscopy. That's examining urine, right?
Yes, physicians would examine glass flasks of a patient's urine, physically holding them up to the sunlight,
Oh, wow. Just staring right into the flask.
staring right at it. They'd study the color variations, the sediment settling at the bottom, and even the smell all to deduce the internal humoral state.
It's basically the most dominant image in medieval illuminated manuscripts, isn't it?
Yeah.
The thoughtful physician just deeply scrutinizing a glass flask of pee.
It really is the iconic image of the medieval doctor. But when physicians had to go beyond merely examining fluids and actually cut into the body, the reality of the era becomes particularly stark.
Yeah. The source text was terrifying here. The surgery.
It was crude. Records show barbers and surgeons performing incredibly invasive procedures. We're talking cutting out cataracts from the eye,
Oh my God.
extracting bladder stones, repairing hernias, and setting severe compound fractures.
Okay, the extraction of a bladder stone stood out to me. Because apparently, this was an excruciatingly common affliction back then due to dietary issues.
Very common, yes.
And the procedure involved a practitioner physically cutting into the perineum and blindly pulling the calcified stone out with specialized iron forceps. And all of this was done with the patient fully conscious.
Completely awake. They lacked any sort of modern anesthetics.
How did they manage the pain? Just grit their teeth?
They relied on heavy botanical concoctions, massive quantities of alcohol, or crude opium preparations. But these were often either dangerously potent-like, fatal, or entirely inadequate for the agony of the procedure.
So surgery was basically an agonizing gamble with a staggering mortality rate.
It really was, and faced with that brutal, terrifying reality of physical surgery, the medieval mind naturally sought intervention from a higher, more reliable power.
Which makes total sense. If the physical intervention is a coin toss with death, you turn to the divine.
Exactly. The physical body was ultimately just a temporary vessel. The primary patient of the medieval hospital was always the eternal soul.
Right, and to truly grasp their approach to healing, we have to recognize that they did not separate the physical from the spiritual, like at all.
Not even a little bit. Illness wasn't merely a mechanical malfunction of biological parts. It was heavily intertwined with a person's spiritual standing.
Meaning that committing a sin could literally physically manifest as a visible disease on your body.
Yes. And because of that, confession was a mandatory prerequisite for admission to many hospitals.
Wait, really? You had to confess before they would treat you.
You had to. A physician believed they could not effectively treat a body if the soul was still harboring spiritual blockages.
Wow.
The internal spiritual rot had to be excised through confession and absolution before the physical rot could even be bandaged.
So once the soul was cleansed, then they applied what we might call targeted spiritual medicine through the saints.
Yes, the invocation of saints.
And they approached the saints kind of the way we might approach specialized departments in a modern clinic, didn't they?
That's a great way to put it. It was based on the specific nature of the saint's martyrdom or popular legend. So, for example, Saint Sebastian was invoked for outbreaks of the plague.
Right, because he miraculously survived being shot full of arrows. And the sudden, piercing strike of an arrow perfectly mirrored how the plague seemed to suddenly strike the body with those painful, inflamed buboes.
Exactly. It was sympathetic magic, almost. St. Lucy was the definitive specialist for eye conditions, derived from the tradition that she was deprived of her eyes during her martyrdom.
Okay, makes sense. Who else?
Well, St. Blaise was called upon for any ailments of the throat, and St. Roche was the ultimate intercessor for pestilence and contagious disease.
And for chronic, seemingly incurable cases, the ultimate medical prescription wasn't a pill, it was a pilgrimage.
The pilgrimage, yes. The ultimate medieval cure.
Pilgrims traveled massive, grueling distances to interact with relics, the physical remains of saints or objects they had touched.
Because they operated on the belief that these items possessed a tangible, radiating therapeutic power, like a holy radiation.
The Shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral is a huge example of this. It was a massive center for this kind of physical and spiritual healing, drawing thousands of desperate people seeking a cure.
And the physical toll of the journey itself was so severe that specialized institutions had to be built along the routes. The hospital at Harbledown, which is located just outside Canterbury, was constructed specifically to care for exhausted pilgrims who became too sick to finish the final agonizing mile to the shrine.
They made it all that way. It just collapsed at the finish line.
Yeah. But even for the patients confined to their beds back in the city hospitals, the environment itself provided a form of acoustic medicine.
And acoustic medicine, you mean the bells again.
The bells and the chanting. The brothers and sisters chanted the 7 canonical hours every single day, maintaining this continuous low murmur of Latin psalms echoing through the stone halls.
Oh, wow.
It acted as a constant stabilizing channel connecting the wards directly to the divine.
You know, peeling back our modern skepticism about relics and prayers, there's actual medical efficacy to this environment.
What do you mean?
Well, being enveloped in a community that fundamentally believes your life has profound eternal significance, that provides a massive psychological safety net.
Oh, for sure. The placebo effect, the reduction of stress.
Exactly. You are constantly prayed over, visited, and given a definitive rhythm and purpose. That level of communal and psychological support has documented measurable effects on physical recovery rates, immune response, and pain tolerance even today.
That is incredibly true. The mind-body connection was fully activated in these spaces.
But this brings up a huge question. If illness is inextricably linked to sin and spiritual impurity in their minds, that framework creates a profound social complication for people afflicted with incurable, visually devastating diseases.
Ah, yes. Which introduces the ultimate paradox of medieval medicine, the treatment and perception of leprosy.
Right, because leprosy occupied this terrifying, highly specific space in the medieval imagination.
It really did. So medically, the disease is known today as Hansen's disease, and it's caused by the bacterium Mycobacterium leprae.
And critically, it is actually remarkably difficult to catch.
Very difficult. It requires prolonged, intimate contact over months or even years.
But the medieval understanding of the disease was the absolute polar opposite. They believed it was incredibly hypercontagious, like transmissible by a passing touch, sharing a drinking cup, or even just standing downwind of an afflicted person's breath.
Yes, the fear was absolute. It was viewed as the ultimate divine punishment, deeply associated with the deadly sins of lust and pride. The belief was that the internal, rotting corruption of the soul was literally bubbling to the surface and eroding the physical body for all to see.
Which is horrifying for the patient. But this intense stigma and terror was paired with this profound religious veneration, which is the paradox.
Right, because an individual with leprosy suffered so visibly and horribly on earth, society interpreted their condition as a form of living purgatory.
They were enduring their divine punishment while still walking the earth.
Exactly. So the theological conclusion was that upon death, their soul was already fully purified by their earthly suffering, guaranteeing them immediate entry into heaven.
Straight to heaven, no waiting in purgatory.
Exactly. And this theology created an incredibly complex, contradictory social dynamic. People with leprosy were heavily stigmatized. They were forced to wear specific clothing. They had to carry clappers to announce their presence. And ultimately, they were exiled from general society into dedicated leprosariums.
Exiled. But they were simultaneously financially supported by that very same society that kicked them out.
Yes. Wealthy citizens and nobles would give generous alms to leprosariums specifically to secure the prayers of the residents.
Wait, they paid them to pray for them?
They did. They operated on the widespread belief that a leper's prayer reached God's ear faster than anyone else's because of their purified suffering state.
That is just absolute cognitive dissonance. You are simultaneously the most feared, physically repulsive outcast of the city, and a deeply holy conduit to the divine.
It's wild, right?
Society is terrified to share a room with you, but they are desperate for you to pray for their eternal salvation.
And managing that extreme contradiction required a very specific logistical and spiritual intervention. A person suspected of having leprosy didn't just quietly pack up and leave town. They were subjected to a formal, rigorous, church-administered ritual.
Right, the document called it the separatio leprosorum, the separation of the lepers.
Yes. Following a formal diagnosis, which usually involved a physician or a priest carefully examining the face, hands, and skin for specific deformations and loss of sensation, the afflicted individual was taken into the local church for a ceremony. And it remains incredibly haunting to read about today.
Haunting is the word. Because the liturgy used for this separation ritual explicitly mirrored the liturgy of a funeral mass.
It was a funeral for the living. The patient would stand in the church, sometimes even standing inside an open grave inside the church, while a black cloth, the exact kind used to cover the dead, was draped over them.
Oh my God.
The priest would throw earth upon their feet, reciting vows that formally severed their ties to the living.
It was a literal theatrical enactment of social death. Biologically, their heart was still beating, But legally, economically, and socially, they were declared completely dead to the mortal world.
Dead to man, but alive to God. They were transitioning into a liminal space, living entirely apart from healthy society in those designated leprosoriums.
But even in that extreme permanent exclusion, the ritual reinforced their crucial place in the broader spiritual ecosystem. They were physically separated from the earthly community, but permanently anchored to the spiritual one.
Yes, they were given a very specific role to play in the grand cosmic order. Their suffering had meaning.
Which honestly leaves you with something profound to consider the next time you find yourself navigating a modern clinical medical setting.
How so?
Well, today we have thoroughly mastered the mechanics of the human body. We can cure bacterial infections that would have effortlessly decimated an entire medieval city, and we execute those cures in highly sterile, perfectly isolated environments.
Which is undeniably a good thing for our survival.
Absolutely. But sitting in a private hospital room, with only the rhythmic, mechanical beeping of a monitor for company, entirely disconnected from our communities, our homes, and our spiritual frameworks, it is incredibly easy to feel completely adrift.
That's a really powerful point.
The medieval separatio leprosorum was undeniably tragic, and it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of microbiology. Yet, it never stripped the patient of their profound meaning within the universe. In our unrelenting drive to perfectly cure the physical machine, we have to ask ourselves if we've forgotten how to create a sanctuary for the isolated human soul.
We have undeniably perfected the science of keeping the body alive. But we could learn a great deal from how they utilized community, rhythm, and purpose to keep the human usually when we talk about the history of medicine, we tell this very specific, almost triumphant story.
Oh yeah, the classic progress narrative.
Right. It's a story of a long, dark period of absolute ignorance, which is then suddenly illuminated by the blinding light of modern science.
Exactly. We just sort of assume that because medieval medicine relied on things like humoral theory and, well, because their anatomical science was dangerously flawed, their patient care must have been equally terrible.
Yeah, but today we're taking a deep dive into historical records that just completely shatter that assumption.
They really do.
We're looking at a medical system totally devoid of modern technology that somehow managed to understand the human side of healing far better than we often do today.
Which is wild to think about. I mean, we constantly conflate technological advancement with human empathy, don't we?
They really do.
We look back at a medical landscape that had no antibiotics, no anesthesia, no sterile environments.
Well, yeah, none of the basics.
Exactly. And we automatically assume it was a landscape devoid of genuine healing. But to understand why that's wrong, we have to, strip away the myths of the Dark Ages and actually walk into these spaces.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Right. So imagine stepping off a muddy, freezing street and walking down this massive stone corridor. The air is thick, smelling intensely of medicinal herbs, roasted meat, and like burning incense.
Oh, wow. So very sensory.
Very. And in the distance, you hear the heavy rhythmic tolling of a bell at a leprosarium.
Just echoing down the halls.
Yeah. Or picture the enclosed, cloistered courtyard of an almshouse, where elderly men sit dozing by small, smoky fires, entirely safe from the winter outside.
Okay, so really we're looking at the distant ancestors of our modern specialized care system,
That's a good way to put it.
like the general hospital, the quarantine ward, and the retirement home. The hardware is identical, but the software running them seems totally alien to how we operate today.
It really was.
So let's unpack that hardware first, because these weren't just, monolithic buildings where they threw the sick.
No, not at all. They were actually highly specialized. So the foundation of the system was the great church-run hospital. Architecturally, these were built almost like cathedrals.
Wait, really? Like with high ceilings and everything?
Yeah, exactly. You had this vast open nave, but instead of pews for a congregation, the space was lined with beds.
That's a striking image.
Right. And at the far east end, bathed in light from stained glass, was the altar. Plus, outside, they cultivated these extensive physic gardens for medicinal plants.
So it was very deliberate.
Completely. And the entire operation was synchronized to the monastic clock. 7 daily prayers that dictated the rhythm of eating, washing, and resting.
Okay, so that covers the general sick, but what about conditions that carried a massive social stigma? Because the leprosarium operated on a completely different set of rules, right?
It was an institution defined by this concept of civic death.
Civic death, that sounds intense.
It was. When someone was diagnosed with leprosy, Society essentially held a funeral for them. Remember that tolling bell you imagined earlier?
Yeah.
That was literally announcing the passage of someone considered legally dead. They were stripped of property rights and forced to wear these uniform gray habits to identify themselves.
That sounds incredibly isolating.
You'd think so, but the historical records show us these places weren't just like grim waiting rooms for ghosts. They were full of living, breathing communities.
Really?
Oh, yeah. We have accounts of residents having heated, entirely mundane disputes over the daily soup rations.
Over soup.
Exactly. I mean, they were managing a terrible exile, but they were doing it as a functioning human community.
Which is just so human. Okay, which brings us to the third institution, the almshouse. And this feels, I think, the most recognizable to us today.
For sure.
It was focused almost entirely on the elderly, the old beadsmen.
Right.
It was a place of quiet routine, small fires, and, continuous prayers for the souls of the founders.
Yeah, that was the core of it.
But to understand how these three pillars of care actually survived or didn't, we have to look at this massive bureaucratic earthquake. The Poor Law of 1601.
Right, the 1601 Poor Law, it fundamentally rewired English society.
How so?
Well, prior to this, caring for the sick or the elderly was a purely voluntary act of religious charity. You gave money to a hospital because it was, good for your soul.
Right, it was spiritual.
But the Poor Law transformed poverty relief into a statutory obligation of the state. It created a system where local parishes were legally required to levy taxes.
The poor rates.
Exactly. They levied poor rates and appointed overseers to manage the destitute. So it shifted the care of the vulnerable from a spiritual offering directly into a bureaucratic duty.
Okay, let me push back on the mechanics of that for a second.
Sure.
Because if the state takes over in 1601 and replaces religious charity with, tax-funded bureaucracy, you would expect all these medieval models to be instantly bulldozed.
Right, replaced by government workhouses or something?
Exactly. But the almshouse model didn't die. I mean, there are almshouses in England right now, today, housing elderly residents and operating under the exact same original foundation documents drafted by their medieval founders.
It's incredible, isn't it?
It's wild. How did they survive a complete state takeover?
Well, it comes down to the ironclad legal framework of their endowments.
Mm-hmm.
The wealthy founders who built these almshouses centuries ago didn't just, hand over a bag of gold.
Right.
They created incredibly strict, inescapable legal trusts bound to specific physical buildings and lands.
Oh, so the law protected them.
Completely. The income generated by those lands could legally only be used to house a specific number of elderly people in that specific location.
Wow.
So the state couldn't easily dismantle them because the property rights and trust laws were too deeply entrenched. The foundational design was just, legally and structurally bulletproof.
That's amazing. Okay, so the hardware survived, but we mentioned earlier that the software running these places was totally different. The foundational philosophy wasn't about public health, and it wasn't about keeping the streets clean of vagrants, even if it, functionally achieved that. The animating philosophy was this concept of the sacred patient.
Yeah. In the medieval worldview, the poor, the sick, and the helpless were viewed as literally sacred.
Like actually holy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were the physical representatives of Christ on earth. So caring for them wasn't just a nice thing to do, it was an act of profound worship.
And that fundamentally changes the power dynamic of charity, doesn't it?
Oh, entirely.
Because today, we often subconsciously view the incurably sick or the elderly as burdens on the system or as failures of our medical technology. We manage them.
Right, it's about management.
But if the patient is sacred, caring for them is the ultimate fulfillment of human duty.
Exactly. Imagine you're an old man in the 14th century. Your body has broken down, you can no longer work the fields, and you have essentially outlived your economic usefulness to your Lord.
Which is a terrifying position to be in.
Right. And today, that loss of utility often leads to a profound crisis of meaning and social isolation.
Yeah, for sure.
But in the medieval system, that old man could sit in an almshouse hall with 11 other men. He would eat his pottage, argue about the weather, and know with absolute certainty that his name was still known.
Wow.
His presence was required, and his prayers for the founders were highly valued currency.
So he still mattered.
He absolutely mattered.
And that meant that a woman legally declared dead by her society due to leprosy wasn't just driven into the wilderness to rot.
No, she wasn't.
She lived in a leprosarium where she could still hear Mass through this tiny architectural feature called a squint.
Oh, the squints? Yeah.
Like a little window carved directly into the chapel wall. She was physically separated, but she knew she hadn't been abandoned by the spiritual community.
Exactly.
Or, on a freezing, brutal winter night, a dying peasant had a physical place with a fire and a bed.
Because their presence in these institutions was not viewed as a failure of medicine to cure them. It was viewed as an opportunity for the community to exercise grace.
That's beautiful.
It was exactly the natural order of things.
Okay, let's step back for a second. Because we are painting a very beautiful, noble picture of this philosophy.
We are.
But we have to be brutally honest about the medicine itself. I mean, we know they were draining blood based on astrological charts.
Yeah, that wasn't great.
Surgery was terrifyingly dangerous and often fatal. They had zero concept of antisepsis or germs. And, ringing a bell obviously didn't stop a disease.
True. Very true.
So if their medicine was actively harming people, or at best doing absolutely nothing, isn't praising these hospitals just romanticizing a severe lack of technology? Like, weren't these places essentially just medieval bed and breakfasts draped in incense?
If you view medicine strictly as pharmacological intervention, sure, it's very easy to dismiss them. But that ignores the massive physiological impact of environmental control. While they failed entirely at the science of curing, they actually mastered the science of caring.
Okay, explain that.
Well, the most critical intervention these hospitals provided was absolute, uninterrupted rest.
I mean, I can see how taking a freezing, starving peasant and putting them by a fire is technically a medical intervention. You are removing the environmental stress.
Exactly. It's basic caloric math.
Caloric math.
Yeah, think about it. A medieval peasant battling a severe infection while starving in the cold is dedicating immense biological energy just to maintaining core body temperature.
Oh, that makes sense.
When you put that person in a warm bed and provide a consistent high-calorie diet, you remove the constant grinding siege of environmental stress.
You free up all that energy.
Exactly. The human immune system has remarkable recuperative powers, but only when it's given the baseline resources to fight. The medieval hospital provided those resources.
Allowing natural recoveries to occur that, to them, often appeared miraculous. Okay, so that makes sense for the physical body, giving the immune system a fighting chance. But what about the psychological toll?
That's a huge piece of it.
Because being put in a hospital ward for weeks on end sounds isolating. Today, we know definitively that social isolation causes immense physical deterioration. It spikes cortisol. It harms the heart.
Which is precisely why the architecture of these wards was fundamentally communal.
Right.
The medieval hospital ward was never an isolating experience.
Yeah.
Even with the limitations of their science, there was always someone present. You heard the murmuring of prayers, the shifting of other patients, the footsteps of the attendants.
So you weren't alone.
No, you were not suffering in a sterile, terrifying vacuum.
And it wasn't just the ambient noise of other people. It was the specific layout of the room itself. Like you mentioned earlier, these wards were built like the naves of cathedrals, with the altar at the east end.
Right, because illness and death were embedded in a framework of meaning. Every bed was positioned, so the patient had a clear line of sight to the altar.
Wow, every single bed.
Yes. Today, dying in a hospital can feel incredibly clinical, shrouded in administrative procedures and blinking monitors.
Yeah, lots of machines.
But in the medieval ward, even the humblest resident knew their suffering was framed within a larger sacred narrative. They knew their death would be attended and their soul prayed for.
It provided a profound psychological anchor that made the unbearable bearable.
Exactly.
But what about the physical treatments, though? We talked about rest and meaning, but they weren't just staring at altars. They had those physic gardens.
Yes, they did.
Were they actually doing anything useful with the plants, or was it just like superstitious soup?
Oh, no, it wasn't just superstition. The monastic physic gardens represent a genuine triumph of empirical observation.
Really?
Yeah. The herbalists didn't understand the molecular chemistry of what they were growing, but they had centuries of trial and error to know exactly what worked.
Like what?
For example, they grew large quantities of plantain to treat wounds.
Plantain. Like banana.
No, the leafy weed. Today we know plantain contains a compound called allantoin, which actively promotes cell growth and tissue regeneration.
Oh, wow.
They also grew chamomile to soothe patients. And we now know it contains apigenin, an antioxidant that binds to receptors in your brain to decrease anxiety and initiate sleep.
That's incredible.
Right. They cultivated weld and lavender. They built a real effective pharmacological toolkit through sheer observation.
This points to a profound philosophical dividing line between their world and ours.
How so?
Well, medieval medicine wasn't ultimately about curing because they acknowledged their limitations. It was about caring.
Yes.
They understood a fundamental truth that modern medicine sometimes struggles with. Like, when medical utility inevitably reaches its limits when the body simply cannot be fixed, what remains is not a failure.
Absolutely.
What remains is responsibility. The responsibility to just sit with someone in the dark and let them know they are not alone.
They never saw the end of medical utility as the end of their obligation to the patient?
Man, so we've talked about the architecture, the philosophy, and the treatments. Let's look at the logistics on the ground.
Okay.
Who are the actual people sitting in the dark with these patients? I mean, the wealthy bishops and merchants funded these places, but they weren't the ones emptying the bedpan.
No, definitely not. The daily, grueling labor was performed by monks, nuns, and members of specific religious orders dedicated entirely to hospital work.
Like who?
Well, you had orders like the Order of the Holy Spirit, which established a vast network of hospitals across Europe.
Okay.
And during the crusading period, the Knights of St. John the Hospitallers ran a massive operation in Jerusalem.
How massive are we talking?
This wasn't a small clinic. They had a permanent, highly organized staff, including 4 physicians and 4 surgeons, managing wards that could hold up to 2,000 patients at a time.
2,000?
Yes. The logistical requirements for food, clean linen, and waste removal on that scale were just staggering.
It's easy to look back at these orders and imagine them as, I don't know, perfect, glowing saints from a medieval altarpiece gliding silently through the wards.
Right, but the historical reality is much grittier.
Exactly. They were profoundly human.
They were, and that human flaw actually makes their achievement more impressive, I think.
Because they weren't perfect.
No. We often only know the names of these specific workers because they appear in legal documents detailing their failures.
Oh, you mean like court records?
Yeah. The records show us a hospital master embezzling funds meant for the poor.
Wow.
We see disciplinary actions against a brother who went AWOL without permission or a sister who neglected her rotation. They experienced burnout, greed, and exhaustion, just like modern healthcare workers.
But despite the embezzlement and the human error, we know they actually did the work and they did it well.
We do.
And we don't just have to take their written word for it. Archaeologists have actually excavated the cemeteries attached to these medieval hospitals.
The bone records.
Yeah, and the bones tell a wild story. When you analyze the skeletons of these patients, you find remarkable physical evidence.
It's fascinating.
They often have incredibly good teeth, and they show absolutely no skeletal signs of nutritional deficits like rickets or scurvy.
Right, which you would expect in a poor medieval population.
Exactly. And isotope analysis of their bones proves they were eating high-protein diets, like far better than the average peasant outside the walls.
That's incredible.
The bones themselves prove these patients were genuinely well-fed and consistently cared for over long periods of time.
That archaeological proof is the physical manifestation of what we might call ordinary holiness.
Ordinary holiness. I like that.
Yeah. It isn't the dramatic holiness of a martyr dying in an arena. It is the sheer grinding persistence of a human being waking up before dawn for matins in the freezing cold year after year to do intensely unglamorous work.
Cleaning festering wounds, changing soiled bedding.
Carrying heavy pots of food to the helpless. Just doing what needed to be done day in and day out in complete anonymity.
It is staggering to think about the scale of this effort. I mean, by the time the Black Death hit Europe in 1347, 5 centuries of this ordinary holiness had built a vast network of thousands of these institutions across the continent.
But, we do have to face the brutal reality of their limitations.
Right.
All that care and all those thousands of hospitals could not stop the plague. The Black Death wiped out roughly a third of the continent.
Yeah.
The medieval medical system was completely overwhelmed. It couldn't cure tuberculosis, it couldn't cure leprosy, and it couldn't stop the plague.
But even though it couldn't stop the plague, it was something.
It really was.
It was a physical, architectural manifestation of the human desire to catch those who fall.
Beautifully said.
Think about how we operate today. We use very different language to describe our systems. We debate social contracts, we legislate human rights, and we fund public health initiatives.
Right. Very secular terms.
The medieval world used the language of purgatory and works of mercy. But the underlying impulse, the deep, inescapable human need to build the hospital, to bring the warm soup to the sick person, to refuse to leave someone out in the cold is exactly the same.
It really is.
It is the defining impulse that makes us human.
Which brings us to a rather piercing question.
Okay.
When we look at our modern marvels, our robotic surgeries, our targeted gene therapies, our incredibly precise anesthesia, we have to ask ourselves, are we truly caring for people? Or are we just exceptionally good at curing bodies?
Wow. So what does this all mean for us today as we navigate our own highly technical healthcare system?
Consider this as a final thought. We've seen that the medieval world built a vast healthcare system entirely around the dignity of the human soul, precisely because they lacked the scientific tools to fix the physical body.
Right.
Today, because our science is so incredibly advanced, we often fall into the trap of treating the human body like a complex machine in a repair shop. We fix the broken part and discharge the unit.
Like a mechanic.
Exactly. So what would a true modern hospital look like if it managed to marry our cutting-edge scientific cures with that medieval obsession with the sacredness of the patient's spirit?
That's the dream.
If we could cure the physical body without ever forgetting to sit with the soul in the dark, that would be the ultimate achievement of human medicine.
That is a powerful vision to strive for, bridging the gap between curing and caring. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive today. We've walked through the stone corridors, heard the tolling bells, and seen the fires of the almshouse. Imagine walking into an emergency room today. You rush through those sliding automatic doors, but instead of a triage desk and a waiting area bathed in that bright fluorescent light, you step into a massive, cavernous hall.
Right.
One that looks exactly like a cathedral, and instead of a multi-million-dollar MRI machine at the very center of the building, there is a stone altar.
Wow.
Even stranger, instead of doctors rushing around with the frantic goal of fixing your biological mechanics and sending you home, the staff's primary goal, the very thing the institution is built for, is to help you die well.
It is a completely jarring image for us to visualize it today. I mean, truly. To really grasp the source material we are looking at, you have to do something incredibly difficult.
Which is what?
You have to actively forget everything you know about modern medicine. Just completely leave the humming machines, the pristine scrubs, and the whole concept of clinical efficiency at the door.
Because it just doesn't apply.
Exactly. Because these early institutions were not engines of curing. They were sanctuaries of caring. And that philosophical distinction, it changes the very foundation of how these places operated.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if you are listening to this custom-tailored deep dive right now, everything you think you know about healthcare is about to be flipped on its head.
Oh, absolutely.
Our mission today is to uncover a fascinating historical mystery, really. Like, what medieval hospitals were actually like, stripped of all our modern assumptions. We are walking into a profoundly different, stonewalled reality.
Yeah, and to even begin understanding the physical spaces of medieval healing, you really have to redefine the core vocabulary. I mean, the very definition of a hospital and who actually belonged inside one was nothing like what we expect today. The root of the entire concept sits inside a single Latin word.
Which is hospice, right?
That's the one.
Hospice.
And that translates to host. But here is the friction I found when reading the source. It points out that it also translates to guest.
Yeah, it does. To our modern ears, that is a total paradox. I mean, you are either the person throwing a dinner party and pouring the wine, or you are the person showing up to drink it. You cannot be both.
Well, in the medieval Christian worldview, that duality wasn't a paradox at all. It was deeply sacred.
Really? How so?
To be a host was to provide shelter and care to a stranger, and to be a guest was to humbly receive it. Both roles were viewed as spiritual necessities.
Oh, I see.
This entire philosophy was anchored firmly in the New Testament. Specifically, they were looking at the Gospel of Matthew, the part where Jesus states, "I was sick and you visited me. I was hungry and you fed me."
So it wasn't just a general sense of like civic duty or community service.
Not at all.
When the people running these early hospitals took in a sick or starving stranger off the street, they believed they were quite literally caring for Christ himself in disguise. That completely reframes the entire motivation.
It really does. It isn't a medical transaction. It is a religious sacrament.
Which I guess explains why the earliest European hospitals didn't start in medical universities or city centers, right?
Right. They grew directly out of monasteries. For the first few centuries of Christianity, monks were mostly just caring for their own sick and aging brothers inside the community.
Cooking it in-house.
Exactly. But then in the 6th century, the Rule of St. Benedict was written. And this text was essentially the blueprint for monastic life. It devoted an entire chapter to the care of the sick.
And it was pretty strict about it, wasn't it?
Oh, very uncompromising. It gave a very specific instruction, before and above all things, care must be taken of the sick.
Wow. It seems like once you declare care for the sick as your absolute highest religious duty, it becomes impossible to keep that contained behind closed monastery doors.
Right. You can't just ignore the people outside.
Exactly. If that is your mandate, you'd logically have to open your gates to the public.
And that is precisely what we see happen in the historical record. By the 7th century, these insular monastic infirmaries began taking in outsiders.
This source specifically highlights the monastery of Whitby, right, in Yorkshire.
Yes, Whitby is a perfect example. We have a 7th century text describing a dedicated building there meant to take in the infirm or those who seemed close to death.
So for all intents and purposes, that is a hospital.
It is. It's possibly the oldest one recorded in England. And from that spark, the concept just proliferates. By the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, these institutions are everywhere.
From major cathedral cities down to tiny rural villages?
Yeah, they're ubiquitous.
I want to pause on who was actually walking through those doors, though, because if you were a medieval citizen seeking entry, you weren't showing up because you needed an appendectomy or, an IV drip.
Right.
The primary demographic filling these beds was a group broadly categorized as the poor. And we really need to contextualize that word because the poor meant something much more expansive back then than just people without money.
Oh, totally. The medieval category of the poor was this vast umbrella of vulnerability. Yes, it included the genuinely destitute who lived on the streets. But it also captured pilgrims who had exhausted themselves and fallen ill miles from home.
People traveling for religious reasons.
Yeah, and it included merchants or travelers who had been violently robbed on the road and had nothing left.
Widows who had outlived their families and their income, too.
Exactly.
Orphans with nowhere to go, elderly people whose bodies were simply too frail to continue physical labor, and even pregnant women lacking a support system.
So it was a very wide net.
If you look at that demographic through our modern lens, these early hospitals function much more like a combination of a homeless shelter, a hospice, and a traveler's inn.
That's a really good analogy.
The people with actual infectious diseases or injuries were certainly in there, but they weren't necessarily the majority. Poverty relief and hospitality came first. Curing the body was almost a secondary byproduct.
Or, to put it even more starkly, they recognized that in a world without antibiotics, without modern surgical techniques, providing physical sustenance and spiritual comfort was often the only reliable medicine they possessed.
Okay, but I have to push back here. From a modern perspective, hearing that curing bodies was secondary sounds highly suspicious.
I get that.
Like, wasn't prioritizing spiritual care just a very convenient excuse for bad medicine? Like a medieval doctor shrugging and saying, look, I have absolutely no idea how to fix this infection, so let's just pray over it and focus on your soul instead.
It is incredibly easy for us to look back from the vantage point of today, see the lack of medical technology, and just assume it was ignorance masked as piety.
It's a tempting conclusion.
It is, but that ignores the reality of their lived experience. It wasn't an excuse. It was a completely different set of priorities regarding what constituted ultimate success.
Meaning what? Exactly.
In their worldview, the physical body was temporary anyway. Providing a good death was actually considered the highest possible form of medical intervention.
A good death. That phrasing really sticks with you.
Think about the alternative, though. The core function of the medieval hospital was to guarantee that a completely destitute person, someone with zero family, zero wealth, totally discarded by society, did not have to freeze to death alone in a muddy alleyway.
Right.
Giving that person a warm fire, a clean bed, a hot meal, and the dignity of having someone sit beside them and pray for them in their final hours was not viewed as a failure to cure.
It was the absolute pinnacle of care.
Exactly. They were actively easing suffering and preparing the person for eternity.
Which means the physical buildings themselves had to be constructed around this entirely different mission.
Absolutely.
If you honestly believe that salvation is the only cure that truly matters, you can't just stick patients in a square cinder block room. The architecture has to literally deliver that spiritual medicine. You aren't building an operating theater.
The physical layout of these hospitals was intensely deliberate. The most common architectural design featured a massive central ward that they referred to as the nave.
Intentionally mirroring the nave of a church. Right?
Yes. We are talking about long, echoing rooms with vaulted stone ceilings, lined with beds on either side.
Let's talk about those beds, because this is a detail from the source that will likely evoke some visceral disgust for anyone listening today.
Oh, the sharing.
Yeah. In the wealthier hospitals, patients did get their own beds. But in the poorer, struggling institutions, you could have 2 or even 3 sick strangers sharing a single bed.
It's true.
I know what you're thinking. Sharing a mattress with 2 feverish strangers when you are already sick sounds like an absolute nightmare of sanitation.
Well, by our standards of infectious disease control, it is a nightmare. But again, context is everything here.
You have to compare it to the alternative.
Right. If the choice is between sleeping on a freezing, rain-soaked cobblestone street in the dead of winter or sharing a warm, dry bed indoors with 2 other people while receiving a bowl of pottage.
That shared bed is an act of monumental, life-saving generosity.
It really is.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The most crucial feature of this architecture wasn't the beds. It was what the beds were pointed at.
Yes.
If you think about an emergency room today, the entire physical space radiates out from the tools of physical curing. The nurse's station, the surgical suites, the MRI machines. But in the medieval hospital, an altar or a chapel was placed at the very end of this long ward.
Right.
The altar was essentially their MRI machine. It was the core technology around which the entire building was engineered.
What's fascinating here is that just as modern hospitals pipe in oxygen to every single bed to keep patients breathing, medieval hospitals piped in lines of sight to the altar to ensure everyone received spiritual oxygen.
Oh, I love that comparison.
Thanks. The architecture was physically designed to administer the sacraments visually.
Really, I need to clarify a quick linguistic collision here because the source uses the term raising of the host when talking about the altar. We just spent a significant amount of time talking about the word hospital coming from hospice, meaning host or hospitality. Are we talking about the same word?
No. That is a vital distinction to make. When historians talk about the raising of the host during a Catholic Mass, they're referring to the communion wafer, the Eucharist.
Okay, so it's a totally different root.
Yeah, that specific use of the word host comes from a totally different Latin root, hostia, which actually means a sacrificial victim.
Oh, wow.
It is confusing in modern English, I know.
Yeah.
But physically, what is happening is the priest is elevating the consecrated bread during the service.
Got it. So the architecture was designed around this specific moment. The beds were arranged so that even a patient who was entirely bedridden, paralyzed, or just too weak to lift their head was angled perfectly to see down the nave to the altar.
Exactly.
When the priest raised the communion wafer, the hostia, every single patient could physically witness it. Even those hovering on the absolute brink of death could participate visually in the spiritual cure.
The building did the work of connecting them to salvation.
And while the focus was overwhelmingly spiritual, we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking these hospitals were chaotic or disorganized just because they lacked modern science, right?
Not at all. The source details the internal geography of the Hôtel Dieu in Paris during the late 15th century, and it was wildly methodical.
They were running a massive operation based on intense, practical observation.
Yeah. The scale of the Hôtel Dieu triage is staggering for the 1400s. They separated patients into incredibly specific wards.
Like, how specific are we talking?
Well, they had a room with 80 beds strictly for those recovering from surgery, and then an 85-bed ward just for women.
That's huge.
It is. Plus 24 beds separated out for pregnant women and new mothers. And a room called the St. Thomas Room, with 60 beds dedicated solely to patients who were in remission and getting stronger.
Notice how they are managing this without any knowledge of germ theory or bacteria.
Right, they had no idea what a microbe was.
Through sheer trial and error and generational observation, they realized that putting a woman recovering from childbirth in the same room as someone coughing up blood was a bad idea. They separated the vulnerable from the infectious purely by observing outcomes.
Exactly. But the detail from the Hôtel Dieu that truly stops you in your tracks is the very first ward mentioned in the source.
Oh, right.
They maintained 54 beds exclusively for the poor and the dying. They had a massive, dedicated room simply for dying.
They weren't trying to triage them toward a cure.
No, they weren't experimenting on them either.
Yeah.
It was a space engineered solely so these individuals could experience their final hours with dignity, surrounded by care and spiritual support, away from the chaos of the surgical or maternity wards.
That is just incredible. But if the altar is the technological centerpiece of the building and the wards are organized with this level of meticulous care, We have to look at the technicians operating the system.
The staff.
Right, because you can't just hire shift workers for a hospital built around salvation.
No, you can't.
The caregivers in these institutions were effectively monks and nuns. They had taken religious vows, meaning they had completely separated themselves from the medieval economy of marriage, property, and personal wealth.
And that economic separation is key. Because they didn't have families to feed or trades to work, they had the time and the resources to act as full-time caregivers.
They didn't view wiping down a feverish patient as employment.
No, they viewed it as a lifelong vocation. It was the grueling, physical expression of that mandate from the Rule of St. Benedict.
Right.
And because they were religious orders, they didn't just work until they were tired. They operated on a rigid, unyielding schedule known as the canonical hours.
Time itself was structured around faith.
Exactly.
And this wasn't just like a morning prayer and an evening prayer. The day and night were fractured into 7 fixed periods of devotion.
It was intense.
It started in the deepest part of the night with matins, usually around 2 or 3 in the morning.
Just consider the psychological and physical toll of that rhythm. I mean,
Right.
in the middle of winter, in a damp stone building, these brothers and sisters would deliberately break their sleep cycle.
Every single.
Every night, they would rise in the pitch dark, walk to the freezing chapel, sing the psalms, intercede for the souls of the sick sleeping in the ward next door, and then try to grab another hour or two of sleep before dawn.
It requires immense physical endurance. You are essentially maintaining constant spiritual vigilance over the patients because the belief was that the spiritual battlefield was just as active, if not more so, in the dead of night.
Oh, for sure. And the rhythm never stopped. After matins came lauds at dawn, prime at roughly 6 a.m., terce at 9 a.m., sext at midday, and then none at 3 p.m.
Actually, quick sidebar on that 3 p.m. prayer because the source points out a brilliant linguistic leftover that we still use today.
Oh, yes.
The word noon. We use it to mean midday, 12 p.m., but it originally came from the name of that 3 p.m. monastic prayer, none.
Yeah, N-O-N-E.
Right. It was only much later in history that the word's meaning drifted backward on the clock to signify midday.
It is a perfect example of how deeply monastic culture permeated everyday life.
It really is.
Anyway, after the 3 p.m. none, you had Vespers in the early evening, and finally Compline, a short, quiet service to close the day before sleep.
This exhausting, beautiful rhythm dictated the pulse of the great church hospitals.
It did.
But what is truly remarkable is how this structured compassion didn't just stay in the city centers. It extended all the way out to the absolute margins of medieval society.
Yes.
When we talk about the margins of the medieval world, the very first image that jumps to mind is the leper colony, or the leprosarium.
Right.
We're so heavily conditioned by pop culture to view leper colonies as these terrifying dystopian horror shows. We picture outcasts wandering in the mud, ringing little wooden bells to warn people away, living in total misery and exile.
It's a very vivid, grim image.
But the source material completely subverts that dark stereotype.
It really does. The Hollywood stereotype strips these people of their humanity by focusing entirely on the horror of the disease.
Right.
Yes, leprosy, or Hansen's disease, carried immense social stigma and fear. Segregation was real. But the historical records show that inside the walls of the leprosariums, these were real, functioning, vibrant communities.
The source notes they were brewing their own beer, they were
Yeah.
keeping beehives, they were having intensely ordinary, petty human disputes about who was singing too loudly in the choir during those canonical hours.
Just think about the implications of that. The fact that they're arguing over choir practice means they had a choir.
Right.
It means they were still observing the hours, still making music, still negotiating social hierarchies. It completely normalizes their existence.
It proves that even when individuals were physically cast out by wider society, their instinct wasn't just to lay down and suffer.
No, not at all.
They actively sought out and built routine. They wanted the dignity of work, like tending bees, and they wanted the camaraderie of a shared song, even if they bickered about the pitch.
And the leprosarium wasn't the only institution operating on the fringes either.
Yeah.
You also had the almshouses, which were arguably the gentlest of all the medieval institutions.
Yeah, these were specifically built for the elderly and the frail individuals commonly known as beadsmen.
Right. If you are picturing a beadsman, imagine an elderly man in a long, simple gown. He can no longer work the fields or ply a trade.
In a purely capitalist society, he would be discarded.
Exactly. But the medieval world created an entirely different economy for him, a spiritual economy. His role in society was to pray. specifically to pray for the souls of the wealthy benefactors who funded the almshouse.
It was a symbiotic ecosystem of care. The wealthy aristocrat or merchant provided the physical sustenance, the building, the firewood, the daily bread.
Yeah,
In exchange, the beadsman provided the spiritual sustenance, performing the labor of prayer that the busy merchant didn't have time for.
everyone retained a vital role in the community.
In exchange for this spiritual labor, the elderly received a warm room, reliable meals, and the absolute comfort of knowing they wouldn't die exposed to the elements. They were tethered together by this slow, quiet business of looking after one another.
It's beautiful, really.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this today? We have traveled from the dual meaning of hospice to the high-vaulted naves of the Hotel Dieu, through the freezing 2 a.m. prayers of sleep-deprived monks, all the way to the beehives of the leprosariums and the quiet prayers of the beadsmen.
We covered a lot of ground.
Why does any of this history matter to us now?
Well, it matters deeply because it acts as a mirror to our modern lives. Today, we exist in a world of hyper-efficient medical cures. We have fluorescent lighting, digital charts, 15-minute appointment slots, and miraculous pharmacology.
All amazing things.
Yes, but within that incredibly efficient machine, it is dangerously easy to feel like you are just a biological mechanism waiting to be serviced, to feel completely anonymous.
Like a number on a spreadsheet.
Exactly. This deep dive reminds us of the profound human roots of healthcare. It points back to an era when the primary goal was fundamentally simpler, yet perhaps much harder to achieve: the patient, unyielding attempt to offer a stranger a warm fire, a shared bed, and the absolute dignity of ensuring that no one, no matter how poor, had to suffer alone.
It is a profound shift in perspective. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the lost art of medieval care. We hope it has given you a new lens through which to view not just our history, but how we conceptualize healing and community right now.
Absolutely.
And as we leave you today, we want to offer one final, provocative thought for you to explore on your own. If our modern, gleaming institutions have finally managed to perfect the science of the cure, what exactly might we have accidentally lost when we stopped prioritizing the quiet, communal care of the soul?